My name is Dr. Vincent Restrepo, and I'm a psychologist who survived the first 4 days of the zombie outbreak. I'm speaking from a hospital basement in Portland, Oregon, where I've watched normal people transform into flesh-hungry monsters. The infected are getting smarter, coordinating attacks, and the survivors around me are starting to crack under pressure. I've spent 20 years studying human behavior under extreme stress, but nothing prepared me for choosing between saving lives and staying human. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dr. Vincent Restrepo, and I'm a psychologist who survived the first 4 days of the zombie outbreak. I'm speaking from a hospital basement in Portland, Oregon, where I've watched normal people transform into flesh-hungry monsters. The infected are getting smarter, coordinating attacks, and the survivors around me are starting to crack under pressure. I've spent 20 years studying human behavior under extreme stress, but nothing prepared me for choosing between saving lives and staying human. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I'm recording this from the basement of Providence Medical Center in Portland, Oregon. It's October 15th, 2024, and the world ended 4 days ago. I've spent 20 years studying human behavior under extreme stress, analyzing how people break down and rebuild themselves after trauma. Nothing in my training prepared me for this. Nothing could have prepared any of us for what happened when hunger became the only human emotion left. Looking back now, the signs were everywhere. I just didn't know what I was looking at. For weeks before the outbreak, I'd been seeing patterns in my patients that should have terrified me. 3 different people mentioned grocery store workers, staring at them like they were food. Mrs. Chun, my Tuesday regular who suffered from PTSD after her military service, kept insisting that people were acting different. She'd grab my arm during sessions and whisper about how strangers would watch her walk by with this predatory focus that made her skin crawl. I thought it was her trauma manifesting in new ways. Combat veterans often develop hypervigilance, seeing threats where none exist. But Mrs. Chun wasn't imagining things. She was detecting something the rest of us missed. The early infected were already among us, blending in while their transformation slowly took hold. They were learning to hunt before they fully understood what they were becoming. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I arrived at my office on the 3rd floor of Providence Medical Center at 8 o'clock sharp, coffee in hand, ready to review patient files before my first appointment. My practice specialized in trauma and PTSD, mostly treating veterans, domestic violence survivors, and first responders who'd seen too much. I developed a reputation for helping people process the unthinkable, for finding hope in the darkest corners of human experience. That morning, I had the news playing quietly in the background while I prepared for my sessions. The reporters were discussing what they called severe food poisoning outbreaks at major grocery chains across the Pacific Northwest, Walmart, Safeway, Fred Meyer, all reporting hundreds of customers falling ill after purchasing contaminated produce. The symptoms they described should have been my first warning. Aggression, disorientation, what they euphemistically called unusual appetite. They kept emphasizing that the outbreaks were isolated to our region, that containment efforts were underway. But I was focused on my work, not the news. My first appointment was with Mrs. Chun at 10 o'clock, and she'd been particularly agitated. During our last session, she'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had been making real progress processing her combat trauma. Lately, though, she'd been fixated on what she called the strange ones. People who moved differently, who looked at others with an intensity that triggered every survival instinct she'd developed in war zones. During our previous sessions, Mrs. Chun had described encounters that I dismissed as hypervigilance. A cashier at the grocery store who kept licking his lips while scanning her items. A bus driver who stared at passengers in the rearview mirror, with what she described as hunger in his eyes. A hospital orderly who followed her down hallways just a little too closely. I'd been helping her develop coping strategies for these perceived threats, teaching her breathing exercises and grounding techniques. I was so wrong about everything. The weeks leading up to the outbreak had brought an unusual number of referrals. From local hospitals, emergency room doctors were sending me. Patients who'd experienced what they termed aggressive episodes. People who'd suddenly attacked others without provocation, then seemed confused and disoriented when confronted. I'd been treating these cases as isolated incidents of stress-induced psychosis, never connecting them to the food poisoning reports or my patients' growing paranoia. One case particularly haunted me. A middle-aged teacher named Robert had been brought in after he'd bitten a colleague during a staff meeting. He couldn't explain why he'd done it, only that he'd felt overwhelmingly hungry and the other person had smelled delicious. I'd recommended psychiatric evaluation and medication, standard protocol for sudden-onset aggressive behavior. Robert had been released after 72 hours of observation. Now I wonder if he was one of the first, if his bite had started a chain reaction that led to this moment. Mrs. Chun arrived 30 minutes early that Tuesday morning, more agitated than I'd ever seen her. She paced my waiting area like a caged animal, checking and rechecking the exits, positioning herself where she could see both the door and the windows. When I invited her into my office, she insisted on leaving the door slightly ajar, something she'd never done before. She sat on the edge of her chair, every muscle tense, her eyes constantly scanning the room. Her military training was showing in ways I'd never observed. She'd reverted to what she called combat mode, treating my office like a potential battlefield. I should have recognized that her instincts were trying to save both our lives. Mrs. Chun grabbed my arm as soon as I sat down, her grip tight enough to leave bruises. "Doctor," she whispered, "they're here too, in the hospital." I asked her to explain what she meant, but she just shook her head and pointed toward the window. "Those people I told you about, the ones who watch and wait and calculate, they're not just in stores anymore. They're everywhere, and they're getting bolder." I tried to redirect her attention to our therapy goals, but she wasn't interested in coping strategies that morning. She kept insisting that I needed to understand what was happening, that the signs were all around us if we knew how to look. She pulled out a small notebook I'd never seen before, filled with dates, locations, and detailed descriptions of people she'd been monitoring. The notebook was extraordinary in its thoroughness. Mrs. Chun had been documenting what she called behavioral anomalies for over a month. She'd recorded license plate numbers, physical descriptions, and patterns of movement. She'd been tracking the early infected without realizing it, creating a detailed map of the outbreak's progression through our community. She'd noticed that certain individuals would appear at multiple locations, always watching crowds with the same predatory focus. She documented how these people moved differently than others, with a deliberate purposefulness that suggested they were hunting rather than simply going about their daily lives. She'd even noted that they seemed to communicate with each other through subtle gestures and sounds that others missed. Mrs. Chun had been preparing for something like this, without consciously understanding what she was preparing for. Her military experience had taught her to recognize when a situation was deteriorating, when normal social structures were breaking down. She'd been stockpiling supplies, mapping escape routes, and studying the people she'd identified as potential threats. She said she could smell it on them, that distinctive scent of something wrong that most people couldn't detect. I thought she meant fear or stress, but she was actually detecting the chemical changes that preceded full transformation. Her combat-trained senses were picking up pheromones that the rest of us couldn't perceive. During our session, she kept glancing toward the window, her body language screaming danger in ways that 20 years of practice had taught me to recognize. She was exhibiting classic signs of imminent threat response, but I was still thinking in terms of PTSD symptoms rather than actual danger. I was treating her hypervigilance as a disorder instead of the survival mechanism it actually was. She told me she'd seen them in the hospital that morning, staff members who moved with that same predatory focus she'd been documenting. She'd watched a nurse follow a patient down the hallway with what she described as hunting behavior. She'd seen an orderly position himself near the cafeteria, not to work, but to observe the people eating. She'd noticed maintenance workers who weren't actually maintaining anything, just moving through the building with that calculating stare. I should have listened to her. I should have recognized that her military training was providing intelligence that my psychological education couldn't match. Instead, I was focused on helping her manage what I perceived as escalating paranoia. I was trying to cure her of the very instincts that might have saved us both. At 10:30 that morning, while Mrs. Chun was describing the predatory behavior she'd observed, the screaming started. It began as a single voice from the hospital lobby, but within seconds, it had multiplied into a chorus of terror that penetrated even my soundproofed office. Mrs. Chun immediately moved to the window, her body language shifting into combat readiness. The screaming wasn't the kind you hear during medical emergencies. It wasn't pain or fear or sudden shock. It was primal terror, the sound humans make when they realize they're being hunted by something that used to be human. Mrs. Chin recognized it immediately, but I was still trying to process what I was hearing through my clinical training. I'd dealt with psychiatric emergencies before, situations where patients became violent or self-destructive. I'd been trained to remain calm, to assess the situation methodically, to follow established protocols. But this was different. This was the sound of social order collapsing in real time, and my training hadn't prepared me for that possibility. The fire alarm activated, followed immediately by the security alert system that I'd never heard before. The combination of sounds created a symphony of chaos that seemed to rise from every floor of the hospital simultaneously. Mrs. Chun moved to the door, checking the hallway while I was still trying to understand what was happening. She returned to the window and beckoned me over, her expression grim but unsurprised. In the parking lot below, I saw something that shattered my understanding of human behavior. A woman I recognized from the hospital cafeteria was attacking a man near the ambulance bay. But she wasn't just attacking him. She was feeding on him, tearing at his throat with her teeth while he screamed and struggled beneath her. The woman had seemed perfectly normal that morning. I'd seen her serving breakfast just hours earlier, smiling and chatting with customers like any other food service worker. But now she moved with a feral intensity that was both human and utterly alien. She was savoring what she was doing, making sounds of satisfaction that made my stomach turn. Mrs. Chun grabbed my arm again, her voice urgent but controlled. "I told you they were here," she said. "I told you they were watching and waiting. This is what they've been preparing for. This is what they've been hungry for." I watched the attack unfold with a mixture of horror and professional fascination. The woman's behavior exhibited aspects of several psychological disorders, but none of them explained what I was seeing. She wasn't psychotic or delusional. She was purposeful, methodical, almost ritualistic in her feeding. This wasn't a break from reality. This was a different kind of reality entirely. More attacks were erupting throughout the parking lot. People were running, but not randomly. They were being herded by others who moved with the same predatory coordination I'd just witnessed. The hunters were working together, communicating through sounds and gestures that suggested sophisticated planning. Mrs. Chun pointed to different areas of the parking lot, identifying the patterns I was missing. "Look at how they're positioning themselves," she said. "They're not just attacking randomly. They're coordinating, cutting off escape routes, driving people towards specific locations." This isn't chaos, this is strategy. She was right. What I'd initially perceived as random violence was actually organized hunting behavior. The attackers were using pack tactics, some driving prey while others waited in ambush positions. They were learning from each other, adapting their techniques in real time. This wasn't mindless hunger, this was evolution. I tried to call hospital security, but the phones were already jammed. I tried to reach my wife Maria and my daughter Sophia, but the calls wouldn't connect. The communication systems were failing as fast as the social systems, leaving us isolated and vulnerable. Mrs. Chun watched me struggle with the phone, her expression sympathetic but resigned. "The infrastructure is collapsing," she said. "When something like this starts, the systems we depend on fail first. We're on our own now, and we need to start thinking like survivors instead of citizens." By noon, the emergency broadcast system was telling everyone to stay indoors. The tone was reassuring, official, suggesting that authorities had the situation under control. But Mrs. Chen and I could see the truth from our window. The authorities were overwhelmed, outmaneuvered by something they'd never encountered before. The broadcast evolved throughout the day, becoming less reassuring and more desperate. Stay indoors became seek evacuation centers. Isolated incidents became widespread outbreaks. Minor disturbances became states of emergency. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they stopped calling it food poisoning. By 4 o'clock, they stopped calling it anything at all. I watched the progression of official denial with fascination and horror. The authorities were following standard crisis management protocols, but those protocols assumed human rational behavior. They were dealing with something that retained human intelligence, but had abandoned human values. Their entire framework for understanding and responding to threats was useless. Mrs. Chun had been watching the broadcasts with growing skepticism. She'd seen enough military operations to recognize when command structure was breaking down. The careful language, the contradictory instructions, the gradually narrowing scope of promised help. She knew we were being abandoned long before the broadcast stopped entirely. At 2:30 that afternoon, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I started barricading my office door. I used my desk, my bookshelf, my filing cabinets, everything I could move. All those books about human psychology, about understanding and healing trauma, became physical barriers against the very trauma they'd been written to address. Mrs. Chun helped me with the barricade, moving with military efficiency that suggested she'd done this before. She positioned furniture to create overlapping fields of protection, leaving us room to move while maximizing our defensive capabilities. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. While we worked, she shared knowledge that my education had never covered. She explained how to identify structural weaknesses in doors and windows, how to create noise-dampening barriers, how to position ourselves to defend against multiple attackers. She transformed my office from a place of healing into a fortress of survival. The barricade took us over an hour to complete, but Mrs. Chun insisted on thoroughness. She'd learned in Afghanistan that rushing defensive preparations usually meant dying from preventable mistakes. She checked and rechecked every element of our protection, making adjustments based on attack vectors I couldn't have imagined. As we worked, she told me things about combat that no psychology textbook had ever covered. She explained how people behave when civilization breaks down, how social structures collapse, how ordinary individuals transform into threats. She was preparing me for a world where my therapeutic skills might be less important than my ability to recognize danger. At 3 o'clock, we heard footsteps in the hallway outside my office. They were slow, deliberate, methodical. Not the hurried steps of someone fleeing danger, but the patient movement of someone who had all the time in the world. Someone who knew their prey wasn't going anywhere. The footsteps stopped outside my door. There was a pause, then slow, rhythmic knocking. The sound was almost polite, like someone making a social call. But the rhythm was wrong, too measured, too calculated. It was the sound of something that remembered human social conventions, but no longer understood their purpose. Mrs. Chun pressed her finger to her lips, her eyes wide with warning. She mouthed the words, "Don't let them know we're here," her military training evident in every gesture. She moved to a defensive position, her body language screaming danger in ways that made my survival instincts finally wake up. Then I heard the voice. It was Dr. Martinez from the emergency room, someone I'd known for 5 years, someone I'd shared coffee with just that morning. But his voice was different now. Slower, more deliberate, like he was tasting each word before he spoke. Like he was savoring the sound of his own voice in ways that made my skin crawl. He wasn't asking for help. He wasn't calling for assistance or medical attention. He was asking if we were tender. The question was delivered with the same professional tone he'd used for medical consultations, but the content was something from a nightmare. He was evaluating us like livestock, calculating our worth as food rather than colleagues. Mrs. Chun's expression confirmed what I was beginning to understand. Dr. Martinez wasn't Dr. Martinez anymore. He was something else, something that retained his memories and knowledge but had abandoned everything that made him human. He was the future that awaited everyone who'd been exposed to whatever was spreading through our community. The knocking continued, patient and persistent. Dr. Martinez knew we were inside, but he wasn't trying to break down the door. He was waiting for us to make a mistake, to reveal ourselves through movement or sound. He was hunting us with the same methodical precision he'd once used to diagnose patients. Mrs. Chun moved closer to me, her voice barely a whisper. She said that Dr. Martinez was one of them now, that he'd been transformed into something that looked human, but thought like a predator. She said it with such certainty, such recognition, that I realized she'd been expecting this moment for weeks. The voice at the door continued, asking questions that became increasingly disturbing. Dr. Martinez wanted to know if we were afraid, if we were hungry, if we understood what was happening to the world around us. He spoke with the patient tone of someone conducting a clinical interview, but his questions revealed appetites that had nothing to do with medicine. I pressed my back against the barricade, my heart pounding with terror that 20 years of crisis training couldn't calm. This was beyond anything I'd studied or experienced. This was the moment when all my professional knowledge became useless, when survival depended on instincts I'd never had to develop. Mrs. Chun watched the door with the focused intensity of someone who'd faced mortal danger before. She was calculating distances, evaluating our defensive position, preparing for possibilities that I couldn't bear to imagine. She was thinking like a soldier while I was still thinking like a therapist. The knocking stopped. The voice stopped. But the presence remained, something patient and hungry waiting just beyond our hastily constructed barriers. Dr. Martinez was still there, still evaluating, still planning. He knew we couldn't stay barricaded forever. He knew that eventually, hunger or thirst or simple human need would force us to make ourselves vulnerable. Mrs. Chun touched my arm, her gesture both comforting and warning. She whispered that this was just the beginning, that what we'd seen in the parking lot was spreading throughout the hospital, throughout the city, throughout the region. She said that everything we'd known about human behavior was about to be tested in ways we couldn't imagine. As the afternoon wore on, the sounds from the hallway multiplied. More voices, more footsteps, more of the patient knocking that suggested intelligence behind the hunger. The infected were organizing, coordinating, sharing information about potential prey. They were learning to hunt more effectively with each passing hour. I realized that Mrs. Chun had been right about everything. The strange one she'd been documenting, the predatory behavior she'd observed, the growing sense that something fundamental was changing in human society. She'd been tracking an outbreak that none of us had recognized, watching our species transform into something that retained our intelligence but abandoned our humanity. The hospital around us was becoming a different kind of institution. Instead of healing, it was becoming a place of feeding. Instead of saving lives, it was becoming a place where life was consumed. The infected were using the building's layout to their advantage, herding survivors into areas where they could be more easily caught and consumed. Mrs. Chen explained that we were witnessing the collapse of everything that made civilization possible. The social contracts that allowed us to trust each other, the shared values that made cooperation possible, the basic assumption that other humans wanted us to survive. All of it was dissolving as hunger became the only motivation that mattered. She said that in war, you learn to recognize when someone has crossed a line they can never uncross. When they've done or seen things that fundamentally change who they are. The infected had crossed that line, but instead of becoming traumatized, they'd become something else entirely. They'd become predators who remembered being human, but could no longer feel human emotions. As evening approached, the sounds from outside our barricade grew more coordinated. The infected were learning to work together, to communicate through sounds and signals that suggested sophisticated planning. They were developing their own culture, their own methods of organization, their own ways of understanding the world around them. Mrs. Chen watched the door with growing concern. She said that the infected were becoming more strategic, more patient, more willing to wait for the right moment to strike. They were no longer driven by immediate hunger, but by calculated appetite. They were planning for the long term, thinking like colonists who intended to build a new kind of society. I thought about my wife and daughter, wondering if they were safe, if they'd found shelter, if they were even still alive. The communication systems had failed completely, leaving me isolated from everyone I cared about. I was trapped in a building that was becoming a feeding ground, surrounded by people who'd been transformed into something that saw me as food rather than a fellow human being. Mrs. Chen seemed to read my thoughts. She said that survival now meant accepting that the world we'd known was gone, that the people we'd been were no longer adequate for the reality we faced. She said that clinging to old assumptions about human nature would get us killed, that we needed to start thinking like the predators we were hiding from. The transformation she described wasn't just about the infected. It was about us, about everyone who hoped to survive what was coming. We would have to abandon parts of our humanity to preserve other parts. We would have to make choices that would have horrified us just days earlier. We would have to become different people to remain people at all. As darkness fell, the sounds from the hallway changed again. The infected were moving with more purpose, more coordination. They were no longer just hunting individuals but organizing systematic searches of the entire building. They were learning to think collectively, to share information, to coordinate their efforts in ways that suggested genuine intelligence. Mrs. Chen whispered that this was how species died. Not through natural disasters or external threats, but through transformation into something that retained the appearance of the original while abandoning its essential nature. Humanity was being replaced by something that looked human, but thought like a hive mind focused entirely on consumption. The knocking at our door resumed, but now it was accompanied by other sounds, scratching like claws testing the wood, sniffing like animals following a scent trail, soft vocalizations that might have been communication between hunters. The infected were becoming more sophisticated with each passing hour, developing new techniques for finding and capturing prey. Mrs. Chen moved closer to me, her voice urgent but controlled. She said that we couldn't stay barricaded forever, that the infected would eventually find ways to reach us. She said that survival meant accepting that our current safety was temporary, that we needed to start planning for what came next. She pulled out her notebook again, showing me maps of the hospital she'd been creating during her visits. She'd been studying the building's layout, identifying potential escape routes, noting areas where we might find other survivors. She'd been preparing for this moment without knowing exactly what she was preparing for. The maps were extraordinary in their detail. She'd marked every exit, every stairwell, every room that might offer protection. She'd noted the locations of food storage, medical supplies, communication equipment. She'd created a comprehensive guide for survival in a building that was becoming a hunting ground. She explained that the basement levels might offer better protection, that the infected seemed to prefer hunting in areas with natural light and multiple exits. She said that underground spaces would limit their mobility while providing us with more defensible positions. She was thinking strategically, planning for a long-term siege rather than a short-term crisis. As the night deepened, the sounds from outside our barricade grew more complex. The infected were developing their own language, their own methods of coordination. They were sharing information about prey locations, about successful hunting techniques, about the building's layout, and defensive possibilities. Mrs. Chen listened to their vocalizations with the intensity of someone decoding enemy communications. She was beginning to understand their primitive language, to recognize patterns in their sounds that suggested specific meanings. She was adapting to their methods as quickly as they were developing them. She whispered that the infected weren't just monsters. They were a new form of human society, one organized around consumption rather than cooperation. They were building their own culture, their own values, their own ways of understanding the world. They were evolving into something that might replace us entirely. The realization was more terrifying than simple monster stories. These weren't mindless zombies shambling through the streets. These were intelligent predators who retained human knowledge while abandoning human morality. They were us, but transformed into something that saw other humans as resources rather than peers. Mrs. Chun said that understanding the enemy was the first step toward surviving them. She was studying their behavior, learning their patterns, preparing for the inevitable moment when hiding would no longer be possible. She was thinking like a soldier facing an enemy that used familiar tactics for unfamiliar purposes. The night seemed to last forever, filled with sounds that suggested the building around us was being systematically searched. The infected were methodical, thorough, patient. They were learning the layout, identifying potential hiding places, preparing for extended operations. They were thinking like an occupying force rather than a mob. As dawn approached, Mrs. Chun made a decision that would determine both our fates. She said that we needed to reach the basement levels, that our current position was too exposed for long-term survival. She said that the infected were getting closer to finding us, that our barricade wouldn't hold much longer. She began preparing for movement, gathering supplies, planning our route through the building. She was thinking tactically, considering factors that my therapeutic training had never covered. She was preparing for combat in ways that suggested she'd been expecting this moment for much longer than I'd realized. The sounds from the hallway were changing again. The infected were moving with more purpose, more coordination. They were converging on our area, drawn by sounds or sense or instincts that I couldn't understand. They were preparing for something, organizing for a coordinated assault on our position. Mrs. Chen looked at me with an expression that mixed determination with resignation. She said that the next few hours would determine whether we survived or became part of the hunting pack ourselves. She said that survival would require abandoning everything we'd believed about human nature, about civilization, about the fundamental assumptions that had governed our lives. She was asking me to trust her completely, to follow her into a world where psychology textbooks were useless and survival depended on instincts I'd never developed. She was asking me to become someone I'd never been, to make choices I'd never imagined, to accept realities I'd never considered. The knocking at our door was becoming more insistent, more coordinated. Multiple voices were calling to us now, using words and phrases that suggested retained human intelligence, but completely altered human values. They were offering us things, promising us outcomes, trying to negotiate our surrender in ways that revealed sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Mrs. Chun whispered that they were learning to manipulate us, to use our own humanity against us. They were becoming more dangerous not because they were losing their intelligence, but because they were applying it to purposes we couldn't comprehend. They were using human psychology to hunt humans more effectively. The dawn light filtering through my office window revealed a world that had been transformed overnight. The parking lot was filled with people who looked normal from a distance, but moved with the coordinated precision of pack hunters. They were organizing, planning, preparing for operations that would extend far beyond the hospital. Mrs. Chun pointed to different groups in the parking lot, identifying their roles and functions. Some were scouts, others were hunters, still. Others seemed to be coordinating communications. They were developing specialized roles, creating organizational structures, building a society based on principles that had nothing to do with human welfare. She said that what we were witnessing was the birth of a new kind of civilization, one that would replace everything we'd known. The infected weren't just attacking random targets. They were building infrastructure, establishing territory, creating systems that would allow them to sustain themselves indefinitely. The knocking at our door stopped abruptly. The voices fell silent. But the presence remained, something patient and calculating that was preparing for the next phase of whatever they had planned. Mrs. Chun tensed, her military training recognizing tactical preparations that I couldn't perceive. She whispered that they were about to make their move, that our barricade was about to be tested in ways we couldn't imagine. She said that the next few minutes would determine whether we had any chance of reaching the basement levels, whether we had any hope of finding other survivors, whether we had any future at all. The silence stretched on, filled with anticipation and terror. Somewhere beyond our hastily constructed barriers, something that had once been human was calculating the best way to reach us. Something that remembered being Dr. Martinez but had become something else, entirely was preparing to show us what we were destined to become. Mrs. Chun gripped my arm, her touch both reassuring and terrifying. She said that no matter what happened next, we had to remember that survival meant more than staying alive. It meant preserving something worth preserving, maintaining some connection to the humanity we'd been, even as we became something we'd never imagined. The morning sun was rising on a world that would never be the same. The infected were organizing for operations that would extend far beyond our hospital, far beyond our city, far beyond anything we could imagine. They were preparing to transform not just individuals, but entire societies, to replace human civilization with something that served their needs rather than ours. And somewhere in the darkness beyond our barricade, something that had once been. A colleague was preparing to show us exactly what that transformation would look like. Something that remembered being human, but had become something else entirely, was getting ready to demonstrate why Mrs. Chun had been right about everything. Why the strange ones she'd been tracking were just the beginning. Why the world we'd known was already gone. The knocking resumed, but now it was accompanied by new sounds. Sounds that suggested tools, organization, systematic planning. The infected were preparing for a coordinated assault on our position, and Mrs. Chen was preparing for the fight of our lives. The voice outside our barricade was definitely Dr. Martinez, but everything about him had changed in ways that made my professional training completely useless. His voice moved slower now, more deliberately, like he was savoring each word before speaking it. When he asked if we were tender, he used the same clinical tone he'd employed during medical consultations. But the question itself revealed appetites that had nothing to do with healing. Mrs. Chun positioned herself between me and the door, her military training evident in every movement. She'd switched into what she called combat mode, treating my office like a battlefield where survival depended on reading enemy intentions correctly. She whispered that Dr. Martinez wasn't Dr. Martinez anymore, that he'd become something else entirely, something that retained his memories and knowledge but had abandoned everything that made him human. The knocking continued with mechanical persistence, but it wasn't random or desperate. It was methodical, calculated, like someone conducting an experiment to determine the structural integrity of our defenses. Dr. Martinez was applying his medical knowledge to hunting, using his understanding of human psychology to find our weaknesses. Mrs. Chun listened to the sounds beyond our barricade with the intensity of someone decoding enemy communications. She'd learned in Afghanistan to recognize when situations were deteriorating beyond conventional responses, when standard protocols became liabilities rather than assets. She whispered that the infected were learning faster than anyone could have predicted, that they were developing sophisticated hunting techniques in real time. She explained that Dr. Martinez's transformation represented something more terrifying than simple madness or disease. He'd retained his intelligence, his medical training, his understanding of human behavior, but he was now applying all of that knowledge to predatory purposes. He was using his expertise to hunt more effectively, to understand prey psychology, to anticipate our responses and counter them. The questions from outside our door became increasingly disturbing as the afternoon progressed. Dr. Martinez wanted to know if we understood what was happening to the world around us, if we recognized that resistance was futile, if we were ready to accept what he called the inevitable transformation. He spoke with the patient tone of someone explaining a medical procedure, but his words revealed a worldview that had nothing to do with healing. Mrs. Chun's notebook contained observations that suddenly made terrifying sense. She'd been documenting behavioral changes in people who later became infected, tracking the progression from normal human behavior to predatory calculation. She'd recorded how certain individuals began watching others differently, moving with purposeful intent rather than casual social interaction, positioning themselves strategically in crowded spaces. She showed me entries from weeks before the outbreak, descriptions of people who exhibited what she called hunting behavior while still appearing completely normal to casual observation. A grocery store clerk who memorized customer routines, a bus driver who studied passenger vulnerabilities, a hospital orderly who mapped staff schedules and security protocols. They'd been preparing for this moment long before anyone realized what was happening. The transformation process she'd documented wasn't random or sudden. It was systematic, purposeful, almost like a recruitment process where the infected were selecting and preparing candidates for conversion. They were choosing people based on their skills, their positions, their access to potential prey. Dr. Martinez had been selected because his medical knowledge made him valuable to their operations. Mrs. Chun explained that the infected weren't just attacking random targets. They were building infrastructure, establishing territorial control, creating organizational structures that would allow them to sustain themselves indefinitely. They were colonists rather than destroyers, planning for long-term occupation rather than short-term feeding. The sounds from the hallway multiplied as evening approached. More voices joined Dr. Martinez, creating a chorus of former colleagues who now spoke in the same calculating tones. Nurses, orderlies, security guards, all transformed into something that used their professional knowledge for predatory purposes. They were sharing information, coordinating their search patterns, applying their collective expertise to hunting human prey. Mrs. Chun recognized the voices of people she'd identified in her notebook weeks earlier. Staff members who'd exhibited subtle behavioral changes, who'd begun watching patients and visitors with predatory focus, who'd started positioning themselves strategically throughout the hospital. Her documentation revealed that the outbreak hadn't been sudden at all. It had been a gradual infiltration, a systematic conversion of key personnel that had been building for months. The infected were using the hospital's communication systems to coordinate their operations. They understood the building's layout, the security protocols, the staff schedules, because they had been the staff. They were applying their professional knowledge to hunting, turning the institution designed for healing into a facility optimized for feeding. Mrs. Chen whispered that we were witnessing the birth of a new kind of society, one organized around consumption rather than cooperation. The infected were developing their own culture, their own methods of organization, their own understanding of territorial control. They were building something that might eventually replace human civilization entirely. As darkness fell, the voices outside our barricade began coordinating more systematically. They were assigning roles, dividing responsibilities, planning operations that extended far beyond our immediate location. They were thinking strategically, considering long-term objectives rather than immediate gratification. They were building an organization that could sustain itself indefinitely. Mrs. Chun explained that this was how invasive species succeeded. They didn't just overwhelm their environment through brute force. They adapted existing structures to serve their needs, co-opted existing resources, transformed existing systems to support their objectives. The infected were following the same pattern, using human infrastructure to build something fundamentally different. The emergency broadcasts had stopped completely by 8 o'clock that evening, leaving us isolated from any official information or assistance. The last transmission had mentioned military containment operations, but Mrs. Chun's military experience told her that containment was already impossible. She'd seen enough tactical situations to recognize when command structure was breaking down, when official responses were inadequate to the threat they faced. She explained that military protocols assumed enemies who followed conventional rules of engagement, who had recognizable command structures, who could be defeated through superior firepower. But the infected weren't following any rules that military planners had anticipated. They were using human knowledge against humans, applying familiar tactics for completely unfamiliar purposes. The transformation of the hospital around us was becoming more evident with each passing hour. The infected were converting the building into something that served their needs rather than human needs. They were establishing feeding areas, creating holding spaces for prey, developing systematic approaches to hunting that maximized efficiency while minimizing waste. Mrs. Chin's military training helped her recognize tactical preparations that I couldn't perceive. The infected were establishing perimeters, creating overlapping fields of coverage, positioning themselves to prevent escape while herding prey toward designated areas. They were applying military strategy to hunting, using coordinated tactics that suggested sophisticated understanding of tactical principles. She warned me that our barricade was being tested not just for immediate access, but for long-term siege potential. The infected weren't trying to break down our door because they didn't need to. They were establishing control over the entire building, creating conditions where we would eventually be forced to surrender our position or die from hunger and thirst. The psychological pressure was as calculated as the physical siege. The voices outside our door were using therapeutic language, offering help and comfort, promising solutions to our predicament. They were applying their understanding of human psychology to break down our resistance, using our own emotional needs against us. Dr. Martinez's voice became increasingly persuasive as the night progressed. He offered medical assistance, promised protection, suggested that cooperation would lead to better outcomes than resistance. He was using his medical authority to gain our trust, applying his understanding of doctor-patient relationships to predatory purposes. Mrs. Chun recognized the manipulation techniques immediately. She'd encountered similar psychological warfare in combat situations, where enemies used familiar social structures to lower defenses and create vulnerability. She warned me that everything the infected said was designed to make us doubt our own judgment, to make submission seem reasonable and resistance seem futile. The feeding sounds from lower floors became more organized as the night deepened. The infected were developing systematic approaches to consumption, creating processes that maximize nutrition while minimizing waste. They were thinking about sustainability, about resource management, about long-term operational efficiency. Mrs. Chun's analysis of these sounds revealed planning that extended far beyond immediate hunger. The infected were preparing for extended operations, creating infrastructure that could support large populations for indefinite periods. They were building something that could replace human society rather than simply destroying it. She explained that the infected retained human intelligence but had abandoned human values entirely. They were applying sophisticated reasoning to objectives that were fundamentally alien to human morality. They were using their knowledge of human behavior to hunt more effectively, their understanding of social structures to organize more efficiently, their grasp of psychological principles to manipulate more successfully. The transformation she described wasn't just individual but collective. The infected were developing shared consciousness, coordinated decision-making processes that allowed them to function as a unified organism rather than separate individuals. They were becoming something that thought collectively while retaining individual capabilities. As midnight approached, Mrs. Chun made preparations for what she knew was inevitable. We couldn't remain barricaded indefinitely, and the infected were establishing conditions that would eventually force us to move. She began planning our route to the basement levels, considering factors that my therapeutic training had never covered. Her military experience told her that successful escape required understanding enemy capabilities, predicting their responses, and exploiting their limitations. She was studying the infected like an enemy force, identifying their strengths and weaknesses, developing tactical approaches that might give us advantages despite our desperate situation. She explained that the infected seemed to prefer hunting in areas with natural light and multiple exit options. They were optimizing their operations for efficiency, choosing locations that maximized their tactical advantages while minimizing their exposure to risk. Underground spaces might limit their mobility while providing us with more defensible positions. The basement levels also offered access to critical infrastructure that might prove useful for long-term survival. Food storage, medical supplies, communication equipment, emergency power systems. Mrs. Chun was thinking strategically, planning for extended operations rather than short-term escape. Her preparations revealed knowledge that went far beyond standard military training. She understood building security systems, emergency protocols, infrastructure vulnerabilities. She'd been studying the hospital's layout and operations for weeks, creating detailed maps and contingency plans that suggested she'd been preparing for this scenario long before it actually occurred. Mrs. Chun's notebook contained escape routes that utilized service corridors, maintenance shafts, and emergency access points that most people didn't know existed. She'd been exploring the building systematically, identifying potential advantages that could prove crucial during crisis situations. She'd been preparing for warfare in an environment that most people saw as completely safe. The sounds from outside our barricade were changing again as dawn approached. The infected were consolidating their control over the building, establishing permanent positions rather than conducting active searches. They were transitioning from hunting mode to occupation mode, creating infrastructure that could sustain their operations indefinitely. Mrs. Chin interpreted these changes as preparation for extended siege operations. The infected were settling in for a long-term campaign, establishing supply lines and communication networks that could support systematic exploitation of the building's resources. They were thinking like colonists rather than raiders, planning for permanent occupation rather than temporary feeding. She warned me that our current safety was entirely illusory. The infected weren't trying to reach us immediately because they didn't need to. They were establishing conditions that would eventually force us to surrender our position, creating psychological and physical pressure that would break down our resistance over time. The morning light revealed the true extent of the transformation that had occurred overnight. The parking lot was filled with infected who moved with coordinated precision, establishing territorial boundaries and communication networks that suggested sophisticated organizational capabilities. They were building something that looked like civilization but served completely different purposes. Mrs. Chun pointed out different groups in the parking lot, identifying their roles and functions based on their positioning and behavior patterns. Some were maintaining perimeter security, others were coordinating supply operations. Still others seemed to be establishing communication links with similar groups in other locations. They were creating a network that extended far beyond our immediate area. She explained that we were witnessing the early stages of societal replacement. The infected weren't just destroying human civilization. They were building something to take its place, creating organizational structures that could sustain themselves indefinitely while serving their fundamental needs. They were evolution in action, species replacement happening in real time. The voices outside our door resumed as morning progressed, but now they were offering different types of persuasion. They promised better conditions for cooperation, described the benefits of joining their organization, explained how resistance would only delay inevitable outcomes. They were using recruitment techniques rather than intimidation tactics, suggesting that they valued our potential contributions more than our immediate consumption. Mrs. Chun recognized these approaches from her military experience with psychological operations. The infected were applying sophisticated persuasion techniques, using our own psychological needs and social conditioning against us. They understood that voluntary cooperation was more valuable than forced compliance, that converted humans were more useful than consumed humans. She warned me that everything they said was designed to make submission seem reasonable and resistance seem futile. They were using their retained human knowledge to exploit human weaknesses, applying their understanding of social psychology to break down our determination. They were fighting a war for our minds as much as our bodies. The infection process, she described, wasn't just biological, but psychological. The infected were recruiting as much as they were feeding, selecting individuals based on their potential value to the organization rather than their immediate nutritional content. They were building something that required human knowledge and skills, not just human flesh. Dr. Martinez's voice became increasingly authoritative as the morning progressed. He was asserting his medical expertise, claiming knowledge about the infection process that suggested cooperation would lead to better outcomes than resistance. He was using his professional credibility to gain our trust, applying his understanding of medical authority to predatory purposes. Mrs. Chun's notebook contained information that suddenly made his claims terrifying rather than reassuring. She documented cases where infected individuals retained their professional knowledge and skills, using their expertise to serve organizational objectives rather than human welfare. Dr. Martinez wasn't offering medical assistance. He was offering recruitment into something that used medical knowledge for hunting purposes. She explained that the infected weren't just monsters or zombies in any conventional sense. They were organized, intelligent, purposeful entities that retained human capabilities while serving completely different objectives. They were us, but transformed into something that saw humans as resources rather than peers, tools rather than equals. The realization was more horrifying than simple monster stories, because it suggested that the infection didn't destroy intelligence or knowledge. It redirected them toward purposes that were fundamentally incompatible with human welfare. The infected were becoming more dangerous as they learned and adapted, not less dangerous as we hoped they might. Mrs. Chun's analysis suggested that resistance would become increasingly difficult as the infected developed more sophisticated techniques and organizational structures. They were learning from every encounter, adapting their methods based on what worked and what didn't, building institutional knowledge that made them more effective over time. She warned me that our survival depended on accepting realities that contradicted everything we'd believed about human nature and social organization. We couldn't defeat the infected through conventional means because they weren't following conventional rules. We had to become something different ourselves if we hoped to preserve anything worth preserving. The transformation she described wasn't just about them, but about us. Survival would require abandoning assumptions about civilization, cooperation, and human decency that had governed our entire lives. We would have to make choices that would have horrified us just days earlier, become people we'd never imagined being. As the second day progressed, the sounds from throughout the hospital revealed systematic conversion of the entire facility. The infected were establishing operational centers, creating infrastructure that could support extended operations, building something that could function indefinitely without external support. They were creating a self-sustaining organization that served their needs, rather than human needs. Mrs. Chun's military experience told her that we were observing the establishment of an occupying force rather than a destructive mob. The infected were following principles of territorial control, resource management, and organizational development that suggested long-term strategic thinking. They were planning for permanent presence rather than temporary exploitation. She explained that our escape to the basement levels would only provide temporary advantage unless we could develop capabilities that matched theirs. We needed to start thinking like them, using their methods against them, adapting their organizational principles to serve our objectives rather than theirs. The afternoon brought new voices to our hallway, infected individuals who spoke with the authority of people establishing administrative control over the building. They were creating bureaucracy, developing policies and procedures, establishing systems that could manage complex operations efficiently. They were building government that served their needs rather than human needs. Mrs. Chun recognized the organizational patterns from her military experience with occupation forces. The infected were following proven methods for establishing control over territory and populations, using techniques that had been developed by human armies but adapted for their specific objectives. They were applying human knowledge of governance to non-human purposes. She warned me that cooperation with their administrative systems would mean accepting their authority, acknowledging their legitimacy, participating in our own subjugation. But resistance would require developing alternative organizational structures that could compete with theirs, building human networks that could function effectively in a world they controlled. The voices outside our door became more insistent. As evening approached, they were setting deadlines, establishing consequences for non-cooperation, creating pressure that was designed to force immediate decisions. They were using time pressure as a psychological weapon, knowing that delay favored their position rather than ours. Mrs. Chun's preparations for movement became more urgent as the deadline approached. She knew that our current position was becoming untenable, that the infected were creating conditions that would soon make escape impossible. We had to move while we still had any advantage at all, before their control became absolute. She explained that survival often meant acting on incomplete information, making decisions based on probability rather than certainty, accepting risk because avoiding it meant accepting worse outcomes. We couldn't wait for perfect conditions, because perfect conditions would never come. We had to move while movement was still possible. The plan she developed utilized her knowledge of the building's layout, her understanding of infected behavior patterns, and her military training in movement under hostile conditions. She was thinking tactically, considering factors that my therapeutic training had never addressed, preparing for scenarios that psychology textbooks had never imagined. Her route to the basement levels avoided areas where the infected had established strong positions, utilized service corridors that provided concealment, and included contingency plans for various potential complications. She was preparing for combat in an environment that had been transformed from sanctuary into battleground. As darkness fell on our second day, Mrs. Chun made her final preparations for what she knew would be our most dangerous hours. The infected were most active during darkness, their enhanced senses giving them advantages that daylight partially negated. But staying in our current position meant certain capture once their patience ran out. She checked her notebook one final time, reviewing information that might prove crucial during our escape attempt. Her documentation of infected behavior patterns, building layout, potential resources, and escape routes represented weeks of preparation that might make the difference. Between survival and capture, the sounds from outside our barricade were changing again. The infected were preparing for some kind of coordinated action, organizing resources and personnel in ways that suggested they were planning to end the standoff. They were transitioning from psychological pressure to direct action, from recruitment tactics to enforcement procedures. Mrs. Chun recognized the tactical preparations from her military experience. The infected were organizing for systematic assault, coordinating their approach to minimize risk while maximizing effectiveness. They were applying military principles to hunting, using proven methods for overcoming defensive positions. She warned me that the next few hours would determine whether we had any chance of reaching other survivors, whether we could find resources that might sustain us long term, whether we could preserve anything worth preserving in a world that was being transformed beyond recognition. The infected voices outside our door were becoming more coordinated, more purposeful. They were counting down to something, preparing for action that would resolve our situation one way or another. Mrs. Chun gripped my arm, her touch conveying both determination and resignation. She whispered that no matter what happened next, we had to remember what we were fighting to preserve, why human survival mattered even when humanity itself was being redefined. The morning sun was rising on our third day, and everything was about to change. The infected were preparing to demonstrate exactly what they'd become, what they were capable of, what the future held for anyone who refused to join them. Mrs. Chun was preparing to show me what survival meant when civilization collapsed and human nature itself became the enemy. The knocking at our door stopped abruptly. The voices fell silent, but the presence remained stronger now, more focused. Something that had once been Dr. Martinez was preparing for the final phase of whatever they had planned. Something that remembered being human, but had become something else entirely, was getting ready to show us what transformation really meant. And Mrs. Chun was preparing to fight for our lives against an enemy that used human knowledge against humans, that retained human intelligence while abandoning human values, that represented the future that awaited everyone who couldn't adapt to a world where hunger had become the only emotion that mattered. The silence outside our barricade stretched on for what felt like hours, but Mrs. Chun's military training told her it was the calm before coordinated action. She positioned herself near the door, listening for sounds that would indicate the infected were preparing their final assault on our position. Her notebook lay open beside her, filled with behavioral observations that had suddenly become our survival manual. At dawn on our third day, Mrs. Chun made the decision that would define everything that followed. She whispered that we couldn't wait any longer, that the infected were consolidating their control over the building in ways that would soon make escape impossible. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd made life or death decisions before, someone who understood that hesitation often meant death in combat situations. She explained that the infected had been using psychological pressure to break down our resistance, but their patience was calculated rather than infinite. They were building toward something, preparing for systematic action that would resolve our situation permanently. Her military experience told her that occupying forces always followed psychological operations with direct enforcement, that the transition was beginning whether we were ready or not. Mrs. Chun's final moments of complete Humanity were spent preparing me for realities that my therapeutic training had never covered. She showed me how to move silently through hostile territory, how to recognize ambush positions, how to read environmental cues that might reveal enemy presence. She was teaching me to think like a soldier, because thinking like a therapist would get us both killed. But something was changing in Mrs. Chen herself, something she'd been fighting for longer than I'd realized. She kept touching her neck, the same gesture I'd noticed in other patients who'd later exhibited aggressive behavior. Her eyes occasionally lost focus, staring at me with an intensity that made my survival instincts scream warnings I didn't want to acknowledge. She revealed that she'd been bitten 3 days earlier, during her initial reconnaissance of the hospital's infected population. She'd been studying them up close, documenting their behavior patterns, when one of them had managed to make contact. Despite her precautions, she'd been fighting the transformation ever since, using her military discipline to maintain control while the infection slowly changed her from within. The bite mark was small, almost invisible beneath her collar, but its effects were becoming more pronounced with each passing hour. She described the transformation as a constant battle between her conscious mind and something else that was growing stronger, more insistent, more difficult to resist. She was losing the war for her own humanity, but she was determined to use her remaining time to ensure my survival. Mrs. Chun's knowledge of the building's layout had been enhanced by her connection to the infected network. She could sense their positions, understand their movement patterns, predict their tactical decisions. The infection was giving her access to their collective consciousness while she still retained enough individual awareness to use that information against them. She explained that the infected weren't just individual monsters, but components of a larger organism that shared information and coordinated actions. They were developing hive mind characteristics, thinking collectively while maintaining individual capabilities. She was becoming part of that network, but she was using her access to gather intelligence that might help human survivors. Her notebook contained information that no uninfected human could have gathered. Details about infected communication methods, organizational structures, tactical preferences, resource allocation strategies. She'd been documenting their society from the inside, creating a field guide for surviving contact with an enemy that thought like humans, but served completely different objectives. Mrs. Chun's route to the basement levels utilized her infected senses to avoid areas where the enemy had established strong positions. She could feel their presence through walls and floors, sense their movement patterns, predict their responses to our actions. She was using her transformation against them, exploiting the connection they didn't know she was fighting. As we prepared to leave our barricaded office, Mrs. Chun made me promise something that revealed the true nature of her sacrifice. If she started to lose control, if the infection overcame her conscious resistance, I had to leave her behind. She said that survival meant making impossible choices, that preserving human life sometimes required abandoning human loyalty. I refused to make that promise, but she insisted with the authority of someone who understood warfare better than I understood therapy. She explained that infected individuals retained their knowledge and skills even after transformation, that a converted Mrs. Chun would use everything she knew about me, about my psychological weaknesses, about my survival strategies to hunt me more effectively. She described the transformation as losing the ability to choose human welfare over personal appetite, retaining intelligence while abandoning empathy, becoming calculating rather than caring. The infected weren't mindless zombies, but intelligent predators who used human knowledge to hunt humans more effectively. Mrs. Chun was becoming one of them, but she was using her remaining humanity to fight their objectives. Her military training was helping her resist the psychological aspects of the transformation longer than most people could manage. She'd learned to compartmentalize, to function under extreme stress, to maintain operational focus despite overwhelming psychological pressure. But she could feel her resistance weakening, her priorities shifting, her fundamental nature changing in ways she couldn't control. The journey through the hospital corridors revealed the extent of the infected's organizational capabilities. They'd converted patient rooms into command centers, established communication networks throughout the building, created supply lines that could sustain extended operations. They were building infrastructure that could function indefinitely without external support. Mrs. Chun guided me through service corridors that avoided their main operational areas, but she could sense their presence everywhere. The building was becoming their territory, transformed from a place of healing into a facility optimized for hunting. They were applying their retained human knowledge to create systems that served their needs rather than human needs. We encountered other survivors during our journey to the basement levels, but not all of them were entirely human anymore. Mrs. Chun could identify the partially infected by their behavior patterns, their movement characteristics, their communication methods. Some were fighting the transformation like she was. Others had already accepted it, but were still pretending to be human. The basement levels contained 6 other survivors who'd found refuge in the generator room, but Mrs. Chun's infected senses immediately identified problems that my psychological training couldn't detect. She whispered warnings about individuals who exhibited signs of partial transformation, who were fighting internal battles they were slowly losing. Tommy, the security guard, had been bitten during his escape from the upper floors, but was concealing his condition from the other survivors. Mrs. Chun could sense the infection progressing in him, could predict how much time he had left before the transformation became irreversible. She warned me to watch him carefully, to prepare for the moment when he would become a threat to everyone else. Sarah, one of the nurses, was showing early signs of psychological breakdown that often preceded voluntary acceptance of infection. Mrs. Chun explained that some people chose transformation rather than fighting it, that the psychological pressure of survival sometimes made surrender seem preferable to continued resistance. Sarah was reaching that breaking point, becoming vulnerable to infected recruitment efforts. Mr. Henderson, the elderly patient who'd been visiting his wife when the outbreak began, was exhibiting signs of what Mrs. Chun called anticipatory grief. He was mourning the loss of his normal life so intensely that he was becoming receptive to infected promises about reunion with lost loved ones. The infected were experts at exploiting human emotional vulnerabilities. Jenny, the teenage girl with the broken arm, was adapting to the crisis better than the adults. But her youth made her particularly valuable to the infected recruitment efforts. Mrs. Chun explained that young people often transformed more completely, retaining fewer human emotional attachments while developing stronger connections to the infected collective consciousness. Jerry, the janitor who knew the building's infrastructure systems, had been fighting depression and isolation long before the outbreak began. The social aspects of infected organization appealed to him, offering the belonging and purpose he'd been seeking. Mrs. Chun could sense his psychological vulnerability, his increasing openness to infected persuasion. The newest arrivals, Dr. Mills and Nurse Rodriguez from the ICU, presented the most complex threat. Dr. Mills had been bitten but was using his medical knowledge to slow the transformation process, creating a dangerous situation where he retained human intelligence while developing infected loyalties. Mrs. Chun warned me that he was the most dangerous person in our group. Mrs. Chun's analysis of group dynamics revealed psychological fractures that would eventually lead to violence, betrayal, or voluntary defection to the infected. She was using her psychological training combined with her infected senses to predict how each person would break. When they would become threats, what triggers would push them past their breaking points. She explained that survival groups often destroyed themselves through internal conflict, that psychological pressure created tensions that enemies could exploit. The infected were experts at psychological warfare, using human social dynamics against human survival efforts. They understood that divided groups were easier to defeat than unified groups. Her notebook contained strategies for managing group psychology under extreme stress, techniques for maintaining cohesion when individual survival instincts conflicted with collective welfare. She was trying to teach me how to hold people together when everything was pulling them apart, how to preserve human cooperation in situations that rewarded selfishness. Mrs. Chun's own transformation was accelerating as we established ourselves in the basement. She could feel her human loyalties weakening, her infected instincts growing stronger, her connection to the collective consciousness becoming more insistent. She was losing the battle for her own humanity, but she was using her remaining time to prepare me for leadership responsibilities I'd never wanted. She revealed that the infected had been monitoring our group since we'd arrived in the basement, that they were studying our behavior patterns and psychological vulnerabilities. They weren't trying to capture us immediately because they were learning from us, gathering information that would help them deal with other survivor groups more effectively. The generator that powered our refuge was running low on fuel, a situation that Mrs. Chun's infected senses told her was being monitored by the enemy. They were waiting for our power to fail, knowing that darkness would give them overwhelming tactical advantages. We had perhaps 48 hours before our position became completely untenable. Mrs. Chun's military experience told her that the infected were preparing for systematic assault on our position, but they were also preparing recruitment offers for individuals they considered valuable. Dr. Mills was already receiving subtle communications from the infected network, psychological pressure designed to convince him that cooperation would benefit everyone. She warned me that the infected weren't just enemies but competitors for the same resources we needed to survive. They were building a society that could sustain itself indefinitely, while we were struggling to maintain a small group for a few days. They had advantages in organization, resources, and strategic thinking that made our situation increasingly desperate. The radio equipment in the basement occasionally picked up transmissions from other survivor groups, but Mrs. Chun's infected senses could detect which communications were genuine and which were psychological operations designed to lure survivors into traps. The infected were using human technology against humans, applying communication strategies that exploited hope and desperation. Military communications had become increasingly fragmented, with units reporting successful containment operations followed by requests for immediate evacuation. Mrs. Chun's experience told her that military command structure was collapsing, that conventional forces were inadequate to address an enemy that used human knowledge against humans. She explained that the infected represented evolution in action, species replacement happening through intelligence rather than physical dominance. They were using human capabilities to build something that could replace human civilization, creating organizational structures that were more efficient at serving their objectives than human institutions were at serving human objectives. As evening approached on our third day, Mrs. Chun's transformation reached a critical point. She could feel her human emotional attachments weakening, her survival instincts redirecting toward infected objectives, her loyalty shifting from our group to the collective consciousness she was becoming part of. She was running out of time to complete my education in survival. Her final human act was giving me her notebook, containing everything she'd learned about infected behavior, group psychology, survival strategies, and the building's resources. She was transferring her knowledge to me because she could no longer trust herself to use it for human purposes. The infection was winning, and she knew it. Mrs. Chun positioned herself near the basement entrance, where she could monitor infected activity while fighting her own transformation. She was using her remaining humanity to protect us while her infected senses provided intelligence about enemy movements. She was becoming our early warning system, but she was also becoming our greatest threat. She whispered that the infected were preparing for coordinated action, that our grace period was ending, that the final phase of their operation was beginning. They had established control over the hospital, consolidated their resources, and were ready to resolve the situation with our survivor group. The siege was about to become an assault. Tommy's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic as his own infection progressed, creating tension within our group that Mrs. Chun warned would eventually explode into violence. He was exhibiting signs of the aggression that preceded full transformation, becoming fixated on the other survivors in ways that suggested developing predatory instincts. Dr. Mills was receiving more intensive psychological pressure from the infected network. Communications that offered medical knowledge, professional authority, and survival guarantees in exchange for cooperation. Mrs. Chun could sense his resistance weakening, his priorities shifting, his loyalty becoming increasingly uncertain. The basement that had seemed like sanctuary was becoming a trap, with the infected controlling all access points and our resources dwindling rapidly. Mrs. Chun's infected senses told her that escape was becoming impossible, that the enemy was preparing to demonstrate the futility of resistance. They were transitioning from psychological pressure to direct enforcement. She warned me that the infected weren't interested in destroying us completely, but in converting us selectively, that they valued human knowledge and skills too much to waste through indiscriminate feeding. They were preparing recruitment offers that would appeal to our individual psychological vulnerabilities, promises that would make surrender seem reasonable. Mrs. Chun's final coherent warning was about the choice that every survivor would eventually face between preserving individual humanity and accepting collective transformation. She said that the infected offered belonging, purpose, and survival, while resistance offered isolation, uncertainty, and probable death. She said that most people would eventually choose transformation. As darkness fell on our third day, Mrs. Chun could no longer guarantee that she was fighting for human objectives rather than infected ones. Her transformation was reaching the point where her conscious resistance might be overcome by subconscious loyalty to the collective consciousness she was joining. She was becoming one of them, whether she wanted to or not. The sounds from throughout the hospital indicated that the infected were preparing for the final phase of their operation. They were organizing resources, coordinating personnel, establishing communication networks that would allow them to conduct systematic enforcement actions. The siege was ending, and the assault was about to begin. Mrs. Chun gripped my arm one final time, her touch conveying both human affection and infected calculation. She whispered that survival meant more than staying alive, that preserving humanity required fighting for values that the infected had abandoned. She said that the real battle wasn't against monsters, but against the part of ourselves that might choose to become monsters. The morning sun was rising on our fourth day, and everything was about to change. Mrs. Chun was preparing to demonstrate what transformation really meant, what happened when human intelligence served non-human objectives, what the future held for anyone who couldn't adapt to a world where hunger had become the only motivation that mattered. Mrs. Chun's transformation accelerated rapidly as our fourth day began, her human consciousness fighting a losing battle against the infected collective that was claiming her mind. She positioned herself between our group and the basement entrance, but I could see her internal struggle intensifying with each passing hour. Her eyes would lose focus periodically, staring at us with the same calculating hunger I'd witnessed in Dr. Martinez and the others. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally came at dawn. Mrs. Chun approached me with her notebook, her movements deliberate and predatory despite her obvious efforts to maintain human behavior patterns. She explained that she could no longer trust her own motivations, that her loyalty was shifting from our survival to objectives she couldn't consciously access, but felt compelled to serve. I used every crisis intervention technique I'd learned in 20 years of practice, trying to reach the part of her that was still fighting the transformation. But Mrs. Chun's military training made her more dangerous than other infected individuals, because she retained tactical knowledge, combat skills, and strategic thinking that served her new appetite rather than her old loyalties. She revealed that the infection wasn't just biological, but psychological, that it replaced human emotional connections with something that felt like belonging but served predatory purposes. She described losing the ability to care about human suffering while developing intense satisfaction from human fear, pain, and submission. The transformation preserved intelligence while redirecting it toward objectives that were fundamentally incompatible with human welfare. The other survivors recognized the threat Mrs. Chun represented, but they were divided about how to respond. Tommy, whose own infection was progressing rapidly, suggested that we should accept her transformation and learn to work with the infected rather than against them. His proposal revealed that his own loyalty was shifting, that he was already beginning to identify with the enemy rather than our group. Sarah immediately supported my assessment that Mrs. Chun had become too dangerous to remain with us, but Mr. Henderson argued that abandoning her would make us no better than the infected themselves. His moral objections revealed psychological vulnerabilities that the infected could exploit, emotional attachments that they could use to manipulate his behavior and compromise our security. Jenny, despite her youth, understood the tactical situation better than the adults. She recognized that Mrs. Chun's transformation made her a source of intelligence for the infected network, that everything she observed about our group would be shared with enemies who were planning our capture or conversion. Jenny's practical assessment cut through the emotional complications that were clouding adult judgment. The vote to isolate Mrs. Chun in the supply closet was close, but necessary for group survival. She didn't resist the decision, which confirmed my suspicions about her psychological state. A fully human Mrs. Chun would have argued, protested, or demanded explanation. Her passive acceptance revealed that she was already thinking like an infected individual who understood our reasoning and approved of our precautions. Dr. Mills arrived at our basement refuge just as we were implementing containment procedures. For Mrs. Chun, bringing news that made our situation even more desperate. He reported that the infected had established complete control over the upper floors, that they were converting patient rooms into operational centers, that they were building infrastructure for permanent occupation rather than temporary feeding. His information was detailed and valuable, but something about his behavior triggered the same warning signals I'd learned to recognize in Mrs. Chun. Dr. Mills kept touching his neck in the same gesture that indicated infection, kept watching our group with calculating intensity that suggested developing predatory instincts, kept offering cooperation that seemed designed to gain our trust rather than ensure our survival. Nurse Rodriguez accompanied Dr. Mills, but her psychological state was clearly deteriorating under stress that exceeded her coping capabilities. She exhibited signs of the anticipatory breakdown that often preceded voluntary surrender to infected. Recruitment efforts. The infected were experts at identifying psychological vulnerabilities, at exploiting human emotional needs to gain cooperation rather than forcing submission. Tommy's transformation was becoming obvious to everyone except Mr. Henderson, who seemed psychologically incapable of accepting that people he knew could become threats to his survival. Tommy's increasing fixation on Jenny's movements, his predatory staring at her injuries, his obvious satisfaction when she expressed fear or pain, all indicated that his human protective instincts were being replaced by hunting instincts. The confrontation with Tommy came at midnight on our third day, when he attempted to break into the area where we'd isolated Mrs. Chun. He claimed he was trying to help her, but his behavior revealed coordination with the infected network rather than concern for her welfare. He was moving with the same purposeful calculation I'd observed in Dr. Martinez, applying his security knowledge to breach our defenses rather than strengthen them. The fight with Tommy revealed capabilities that no human should have possessed. He was stronger, faster, more resilient than any normal person, suggesting that the infection enhanced physical abilities while redirecting psychological priorities. He fought with coordination that indicated tactical communication with other infected individuals, using strategies that our group couldn't have anticipated. We managed to subdue Tommy only through collective action that required everyone except Mr. Henderson to participate. The old man refused to fight someone he still considered human, a moral stance that nearly got Jenny killed when Tommy focused his attack on her specifically. Henderson's inability to accept reality was becoming a liability that threatened everyone's survival. The aftermath of Tommy's transformation forced us to confront realities that contradicted everything we'd believed about human nature and social cooperation. We had killed someone we'd known and trusted, someone who'd been protecting us just hours earlier. The psychological trauma was devastating, but the alternative would have been our own conversion or consumption. Dr. Mills' reaction to Tommy's death revealed his own psychological state more clearly than his words or actions. He showed no grief, no shock, no emotional response to watching a colleague die violently. His clinical detachment suggested that he was already thinking like an infected individual who saw humans as resources rather than peers, problems to be solved rather than people to be mourned. Sarah recognized the signs immediately, her nursing experience helping her identify the behavioral changes that indicated advancing infection. She warned the group that Dr. Mills represented the same threat Tommy had posed, that his medical knowledge made him even more dangerous because he understood human psychology well enough to manipulate our responses effectively. The arrival of 2 new survivors during our 4th day created additional complications that strained our already fragile group dynamics. Dr. Mills and Nurse Rodriguez claimed to have escaped from the ICU, but their stories contained inconsistencies that suggested possible infected infiltration rather than genuine human survival. My psychological training helped me identify deception indicators in their accounts, but the other survivors were desperate enough for hope that they wanted to believe the newcomers were genuine. People under extreme stress often accept information that confirms their wishes rather than evaluating it objectively, a vulnerability that infected recruitment efforts specifically targeted. The supply crisis was becoming critical as our food reserves dwindled to perhaps 1 day's worth of nutrition for 8 people. The infected were applying siege tactics, waiting for hunger and thirst to break down our resistance rather than risking casualties in direct assault. They understood human psychology well enough to know that desperation would eventually force us to make mistakes. Dr. Mills suggested rationing strategies that seemed reasonable, but would actually accelerate our psychological breakdown by creating internal competition for resources. His proposals were designed to divide our group, to create conflicts that would weaken our collective resistance while strengthening individual incentives to seek infected protection. The generator failure on our 4th morning plunged us into darkness that gave the infected overwhelming tactical advantages. They could see, hear, and move more effectively than humans in low-light conditions, while we became vulnerable to attack from directions we couldn't monitor adequately. The timing wasn't coincidental, but part of their systematic approach to breaking down our defenses. Mr. Henderson's psychological breakdown accelerated in the darkness, his grip on reality weakening, as he became increasingly convinced that his deceased wife was calling to him from somewhere in the hospital. The infected were using psychological warfare, exploiting his grief to lure him away from group protection toward areas where he could be captured or converted. Jenny's practical intelligence became our most valuable asset as adult decision-making capabilities deteriorated under psychological pressure. She understood tactical realities that the adults were too emotionally compromised to accept, recognized threats that experience and education had failed to prepare us for, maintained focus on survival objectives while the rest of us struggled with moral complications. Dr. Mills' true nature became undeniable when he began receiving communications from the infected network, subtle signals that he tried to conceal, but that revealed his connection to enemy operations. He was serving as their intelligence source, gathering information about our capabilities, resources, and psychological vulnerabilities that would help them plan more effective recruitment or enforcement strategies. His medical authority gave him credibility that he was using to undermine group cohesion, to create doubt about our survival chances, to suggest that cooperation with the infected offered better outcomes than continued resistance. He was applying therapeutic techniques to break down our psychological defenses, using his professional knowledge to serve predatory objectives. The coordinated attack on our position came at dawn on our fourth day with infected individuals, testing our defenses simultaneously from multiple directions. They weren't trying to overwhelm us through force, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance, to show us that escape was impossible and surrender was inevitable. Dr. Mills revealed his true allegiance during the attack, opening our barricades and calling to the infected attackers with communication methods that indicated full integration into their network. He wasn't just converted, but had become an active recruiter, using his position within our group to facilitate operations that served infected objectives rather than human survival. The siege revealed tactical capabilities that exceeded anything military planners had anticipated. The infected were using human knowledge against humans, applying familiar strategies for completely unfamiliar purposes, coordinating actions that suggested command structures more sophisticated than most human organizations could manage. Sarah's nursing experience helped her recognize that the infected weren't just attacking, but testing, gathering information about human defensive capabilities that would help them deal with other survivor groups more effectively. We weren't just fighting for our own lives, but potentially determining the survival strategies that other humans would need to develop. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable as the infected demonstrated that resistance only delayed inevitable outcomes. They were patient, organized, and systematic in ways that human desperation couldn't match. They had time, resources, and coordination that made our situation increasingly hopeless with each passing hour. Mr. Henderson's attempt to surrender revealed the infected recruitment process more clearly than any previous encounter. They weren't interested in immediate conversion, but in selective recruitment based on skills, knowledge, and psychological suitability. They were building something that required human capabilities, not just human flesh. Jenny's refusal to surrender despite overwhelming odds reminded me why human survival mattered even when humanity itself was being redefined. She represented hope that wasn't based on probability, but on principle, determination that wasn't calculated, but genuine, resistance that wasn't strategic but moral. The infected ultimatum came as dawn broke on what might be our final day. Dr. Mills delivered their message with the authority of someone who'd accepted their legitimacy, who believed that cooperation offered better outcomes than resistance. He was offering us choices that seemed reasonable, but served objectives that were fundamentally incompatible with human welfare. The deadline they set wasn't arbitrary, but calculated to maximize psychological pressure while minimizing their operational costs. They understood human decision-making processes well enough to know exactly how much time we needed to break down psychologically, how much pressure would force us to choose surrender over continued suffering. As morning progressed toward their deadline, I realized that Mrs. Chun had been preparing me for exactly this moment. Her sacrifice, her warnings, her knowledge transfer, all designed to help me make the choice that would determine not just our immediate survival, but the kind of people we would remain regardless of outcome. The infected were offering survival, but survival that required abandoning everything that made survival worthwhile. They were promising belonging, but belonging to something that saw humans as resources rather than equals. They were guaranteeing safety, but safety that came at the cost of everything that made us human. The standoff with Dr. Mills reached its critical moment as dawn broke on our fourth day. He stood by the barricade with his hand positioned to remove our defenses, his medical authority lending credibility to promises that cooperation would ensure our survival. Everything Mrs. Chun had taught me about reading people under extreme stress told me that Dr. Mills was no longer making decisions based on human welfare, but on objectives that served the infected collective. I used every crisis intervention technique I developed in 20 years of practice to manage our group's response to his ultimatum. Sarah wanted to fight. Jenny was calculating escape possibilities. Mr. Henderson was wavering between surrender and resistance, while Nurse Rodriguez seemed paralyzed by psychological pressure that exceeded her coping capabilities. The group was fracturing exactly as the infected had planned. My analysis of Dr. Mills revealed coordination with the infected network that went beyond simple conversion. He was applying his medical knowledge to psychological warfare, using his understanding of human stress responses to break down our resistance. Systematically, he wasn't just offering survival but promising reunion with lost loved ones, medical treatment for injuries, protection from the chaos consuming the outside world. Mrs. Chun's notebook provided insights that proved crucial during this final confrontation. Her documentation of infected recruitment strategies revealed that they valued human knowledge and skills too much to waste through indiscriminate consumption. They were building something that required human capabilities, creating organizational structures that could function more efficiently than human institutions had ever managed. The infected ultimatum wasn't random, but carefully calculated based on psychological profiles they developed for each member of our group. Dr. Mills knew exactly which promises would appeal to each person's specific vulnerabilities, which threats would break down individual resistance, which incentives would make cooperation seem reasonable rather than treasonous. I recognized the manipulation techniques from my therapeutic training, but seeing them applied for predatory purposes rather than healing created cognitive dissonance that nearly overwhelmed my professional objectivity. The infected were using human psychology against humans, applying knowledge that had been developed to help people in order to hunt them more effectively. The group's decision-making process revealed psychological fractures that had been developing since our first day together. Mr. Henderson's grief made him vulnerable to promises about reunion with his deceased wife. Sarah's professional obligations made her susceptible to medical arguments about reducing suffering. Nurse Rodriguez's isolation made her desperate for belonging that the infected offered. Jenny's practical intelligence cut through the emotional manipulation that was compromising adult judgment. She recognized that the infected promises were designed to exploit psychological needs rather than address them, that cooperation would lead to conversion rather than protection, that surrender would preserve our lives only by destroying everything that made those lives worth preserving. My psychological analysis of Dr. Mills revealed that his transformation hadn't eliminated his intelligence or professional knowledge but had redirected them toward objectives that were fundamentally incompatible with human welfare. He retained his medical training, his understanding of trauma and stress, his ability to read psychological vulnerabilities, but he was using all of that knowledge to serve the infected rather than human patients. The infected had chosen him as their representative precisely because his medical authority gave him credibility that other converted individuals couldn't match. They understood human social hierarchies well enough to know that we would trust medical expertise, even when that expertise was being used against us. They were applying human psychology to hunting humans more effectively. Mrs. Chun's legacy became clear as I applied her teachings to our current crisis. She'd been preparing me not just for tactical survival, but for psychological leadership, for making decisions that preserved human values even when human survival seemed impossible. She'd taught me that the real battle wasn't against monsters, but against the part of ourselves that might choose to become monsters. The confrontation revealed the true nature of the choice every survivor would eventually face. The infected offered belonging, purpose, protection, and survival, but survival that required abandoning empathy, compassion, and moral responsibility. They promised to solve human problems by eliminating humanity itself, to end suffering by ending the capacity to care about suffering. I challenged Dr. Mills' claims about peaceful coexistence by asking specific questions about his transformation experience, about the bite mark he was trying to conceal, about the duration of his infection, and the progression of his symptoms. His responses revealed that he'd been converted for days rather than hours, that he'd been planning our capture rather than seeking our rescue. The group's reaction to these revelations split along lines that Mrs. Chun's psychological profiles had predicted. Sarah and Jenny immediately recognized the threat and prepared for resistance, while Mr. Henderson and Nurse Rodriguez struggled to accept that someone offering help could actually represent danger. The infected had chosen their representative perfectly, Dr. Mills. True intentions became undeniable when he began describing the infected social structure with enthusiasm rather than horror. He spoke about collective consciousness, shared purpose, elimination of individual suffering through absorption into something larger than themselves. He was recruiting rather than warning, selling transformation as evolution rather than describing it as loss. His medical knowledge allowed him to explain the infection process in terms that made conversion seem like treatment rather than destruction. He described the elimination of human emotional attachments as freedom from psychological suffering, the replacement of individual consciousness with collective awareness as transcendence rather than death. The infected psychology he revealed was more terrifying than simple monster behavior, because it suggested that transformation preserved intelligence, while eliminating the capacity for moral choice. They weren't evil in any conventional sense, but had moved beyond human concepts of good and evil entirely, operating according to principles that prioritized efficiency over ethics. My intervention during Dr. Mills' recruitment effort required applying therapeutic techniques in reverse, using my understanding of psychological manipulation to counter his influence rather than facilitate healing. I had to become manipulative myself to protect the group from manipulation, abandoning therapeutic ethics to preserve human survival. The group's final decision came down to a fundamental question about the nature of human survival. Were we fighting to preserve individual lives or human values, biological existence or psychological identity, survival, or humanity itself? The infected were offering the first while demanding abandonment of the second. Sarah's nursing experience helped her recognize that the infected represented a form of psychological contagion that spread through hope as much as through violence. They were using human emotional needs against humans, offering solutions to problems that required abandoning the capacity to recognize those problems as significant. Jenny's youth gave her advantages that adult experience couldn't match. She hadn't invested decades in beliefs about human nature, social cooperation, or moral obligation that made accepting the infected worldview psychologically devastating. She could adapt to realities that contradicted everything the adults had believed about civilization. Mr. Henderson's surrender attempt revealed the infected recruitment process more clearly than Dr. Mills' explanations had managed. They subjected potential converts to psychological evaluation, testing their knowledge, skills, and psychological suitability before deciding whether conversion or consumption would serve their objectives better. The infected rejection of Mr. Henderson's surrender demonstrated that they were more selective than desperate, more strategic than hungry. They weren't accepting everyone who offered to join them, but were building an organization that could function efficiently rather than simply growing as rapidly as possible. Dr. Mills' role in this evaluation process confirmed that he'd been functioning as their recruiter rather than their representative. He was assessing our group's potential value, identifying individuals who possessed knowledge or skills that could serve infected objectives, recommending conversion priorities based on our capabilities rather than our willingness to cooperate. My escape plan utilized Mrs. Chin's documentation of the hospital's infrastructure systems, Her maps of service corridors and emergency access points, her analysis of infected behavior patterns and tactical preferences. She'd prepared a comprehensive survival strategy that could work even against enemies who retained human intelligence while serving non-human objectives. The plan required accepting that our basement refuge had become a trap rather than sanctuary, that the infected controlled all conventional access points. That escape would require using routes they hadn't anticipated because those routes required knowledge that only Mrs. Chun's systematic reconnaissance had provided. Sarah's medical training proved crucial for treating injuries sustained during our escape attempt, but she had to adapt her therapeutic knowledge to tactical situations that medical school had never covered. She was learning to prioritize survival over healing, immediate effectiveness over long-term outcomes. Jenny's practical intelligence helped coordinate our movements through hostile territory, her youth providing physical capabilities that adult experience couldn't match. She was thinking tactically rather than emotionally, calculating probabilities rather than processing trauma, adapting faster than any of us could have anticipated. The infected response to our escape attempt revealed coordination capabilities that exceeded anything military planners had encountered. They were sharing information instantly across their network, adapting their tactics in real time, applying collective intelligence to problems that human organizations would have required extensive communication and planning to address. Our current position in the basement represents temporary safety rather than permanent refuge. The infected are patient, organized, and systematic in ways that human desperation cannot match. They have established control over the building, consolidated their resources, and demonstrated that resistance only delays outcomes they consider inevitable. Dr. Mills remains with them somewhere in the hospital, probably planning our next encounter, using his knowledge of our psychology and capabilities to develop more effective recruitment strategies. The infected learn from every interaction, adapting their methods based on what works and what doesn't, building institutional knowledge that makes them more dangerous over time. The other survivors who chose cooperation rather than resistance are learning what transformation actually means, discovering that the infected promises were accurate in technical terms, but devastating in human terms. They are preserving their lives while losing everything that made those lives worth preserving. Mrs. Chun's warning about the real enemy has proven prophetic in ways I couldn't have imagined. The infected aren't our only threat because the greatest danger comes from people who believe that surrendering humanity is an acceptable price for survival. They make infected recruitment easier by demonstrating that resistance is futile, hope is illusory, and cooperation is inevitable. The psychological toll of our experience is changing us in ways that mirror the infected transformation without requiring biological conversion. We are becoming harder, more calculating, more willing to make choices that would have horrified us just days earlier. Survival is transforming us into people we might not recognize. My documentation of these events serves multiple purposes beyond simple record keeping. Recording our story helps maintain connection to human values that the infected have abandoned, preserves knowledge that might help other survivors, demonstrates that resistance is possible even when victory seems impossible. The infected are spreading beyond our hospital, establishing networks that connect similar operations in other locations, building infrastructure that could eventually replace human civilization entirely. They represent evolution in action, species replacement happening through intelligence rather than physical dominance. Their success depends on human acceptance of their fundamental premise that biological survival justifies abandoning psychological humanity. They offer solutions to human problems that require eliminating the capacity to recognize those problems as significant, promising peace through the elimination of the ability to choose conflict. Our resistance represents more than individual survival, because it demonstrates that human values can survive even when human institutions collapse. We are preserving something worth preserving, maintaining connections to principles that transcend immediate survival calculations, proving that humanity is more than biology. The choice every survivor faces isn't between life and death, but between different definitions of what life means. The infected offer biological continuation at the cost of psychological identity, survival that requires abandoning everything. That makes survival meaningful. Tomorrow we will face new challenges, make new choices, confront new evidence about what humanity means when humanity itself becomes the enemy. The infected are evolving, learning, adapting, but so are we. The question isn't whether we can defeat them, but whether we can remain worth saving in the process. This is Dr. Vincent Restrepo, survivor of the first 4 days of what might be the end of human civilization as we've known it. But endings are also beginnings, and what we become tomorrow depends on choices we make today. The infected represent one possible future for our species, but resistance represents another. The story continues because we choose to continue it. Because survival means more than staying alive. Because humanity is worth preserving, even when preservation seems impossible.